Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our conversation on authoritarianism and suppression of the opposition. I'm Megan. I am the coordinator of Code Pink's China's Not Our Enemy campaign, which is working to expose the US Cold War on China, the propaganda pushing for war, and overall to advocate pivoting away from increased militarism in the Pacific and against US imperialism worldwide. We are currently living through a moment where the US government and institutions across the country are cracking down on dissent with increased boldness. We've seen brutal repression of Palestine solidarity encampments, mass arrests of students and faculty, and a coordinated campaign to criminalize protest. Meanwhile, ICE raids, deportations, surveillance of immigrants continue in the shadows, and Chinese students and scholars are being targeted under a veil of national security, while entire movements and communities are painted as threats simply for daring to challenge empire. So this isn't happening in isolation. This crackdown is part of a broader authoritarian strategy, one that sees any opposition to US foreign or domestic policy as dangerous, disloyal, and criminal. Whether it's solidarity with Palestine, support for immigration justice, or simply advocating for a multipolar world, dissent is being suppressed. That's why we are very honored to be joined today by two brilliant thinkers and journalists who have been on the front lines of exposing the hypocrisy of US imperialism and the way it uses the language of freedom and democracy to enforce violence and political repression, both at home and abroad. Together, they're going to help us see the connections between what's happening on our campuses and our communities and around the world to uncover the ongoing suppression and direct us toward resistance, as well as the protection of ourselves and of our wider communities. So first, I would like to introduce the esteemed Carl Jha. Carl is the creator of the Silk and Steel podcast, which explores China, history, politics, and culture from a non-Western perspective. Through humor, deep analysis, and storytelling, Carl has helped challenge Western narratives about China and Asia more broadly, highlighting the dangers of propaganda and how it's used to justify conflict and suppress truth. Hi, Carl. Thanks for joining us today, and welcome to our other guest.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. My babysitter left at the last minute, so I'm gonna do double duty today. This is my son. Ouija, hello guys. So I thank you for inviting me. As you have mentioned, we are at a very critical juncture where U.S. is ramping up for war. We're already in the midst of a Cold War 2.0. This is but now they're also preparing for a possible kinetic war with China over Pacific. And we just recently have the FBI director went to New Zealand, Kash Patel. He announced the opening of an FBI office in New Zealand. Now people will be asking why is he opening an FBI office in New Zealand when what we really wanted to see is a release of Epstein's list. But what happened is this is actually a playbook the U.S. have been playing with among its client states. In specific the Five Eye countries. The Five Eye countries will be the so-called Anglo Five: United States, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And what the US has been doing in the past 10 years is through its working with intelligence agency in these countries to root out opposition, and particularly to root out opposition to war with China. We saw this happening in Australia, in Canada. There will be some intelligence reports saying China is interfering with local election, with China is interfering in the local politics. But the real goal is to rooting out dissent from questioning why is it necessary for us to have a confrontation with China, especially in the case of New Zealand and Australia. Their largest export customer is China. It actually does not make sense for them to go to war against their largest export market, but yet this is done at behest of United States. Now U.S. is basically tightening the news. New Zealand is often seen as the weakest link among the Five Eye countries. So this is why they're now opening a FBI office in New Zealand. Help, quote unquote. They said to, oh, my babysitter is here. Sorry, let me excuse me for a second. Can Danny take over for a second?
Sure, no problem. Yeah, we can go over to Danny and come back to you after. So I'll introduce Danny, unless you want to keep going.
Oh, I don't know. Is Carl is Carl ready? I mean,
No,
I have something to
Danny,
say.
go ahead.
Oh,
Okay, so next up, we are joined by Danny Haiphong. Danny is a social activist, writer, political analyst. He's a frequent contributor to Black Agenda Report, and his articles have appeared in publications such as Mint Press News, Counterpunch, Center for Global Research. Danny currently has one of the clearest voices speaking out against new Cold War on China, has continuously helped expose the U.S. bipartisan war agenda. Welcome, Danny.
thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really appreciative to be here. I really appreciate being here, especially Carl's a friend of mine, so it's great to share this stage with him. So let me begin. I guess I'll take the full 15 minutes and then give it back to Carl. So I wanted to begin just saying first that authoritarianism, repression, these words are critical right now to investigate and study, and that there really is nothing more repressive than a genocide like the one that the US and Israel are committing in Gaza. There's nothing more authoritarian than the US empire's wars. They require the full subjugation of both the rights and the interests of the people of targeted nations, as well as the complete obliteration and eventual obliteration of any kind of human rights for those living under the political jurisdiction of the warmongers in Washington and its so called allies across the West and elsewhere. Code Pink now, and I just want to thank Code Pink not only for inviting me, but for resisting these wars, educating people about these wars, because this is so invaluable and deserving of recognition, and more importantly, for anyone paying attention to join the fight that Code Pink is in. So I want to talk about the fundamental shift, the context that really can help us understand repression, help us understand the suppression of opposition, the
So
fundamental shift that's
I
happening
have
in the
no
world.
sound.
And it involves not only China, but the entire global South. It involves an organization called BRICS and others like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We are witnessing today the logical continuation of resistance to colonialism and imperialism of the 20th century under 21st century conditions. Now, despite decades of aggression, US empire has not succeeded in toppling China, and now China is leading this economic and political revival of the global South, which is changing everything about the world order. Some have called this rise a multipolar world or a multinodal world where many various economic arrangements exist in the world. But I believe this is actually an understatement of this historic moment, which I believe is actually the final battle in the quest for self determination of the world's colonized and oppressed, and the end of the historical epoch of Western domination itself. The US will be the last empire in the centuries long scourge of theft, looting, war, and destabilization led by the collective West. Now, the US empire exhibits all the signs of decline and collapse: a shrinking relative share of the global economy, stagnant economic growth, rising poverty, crumbling infrastructure, a rapacious oligarchy, furiously consolidating wealth, and an increasingly repressive state apparatus constantly perfecting weapons of war used abroad and against selected groups in the United States, such as Black Americans, in order to apply them more broadly, as we've seen in the Patriot Act and other examples, to the rest of the population. And so on the other side, we see a rising global South, the fastest economic growth being in Asia and Africa. China's miraculous economic development surpassing the US in many categories of high tech, most if not all in high tech and infrastructure development, rising living standards, and a framework for peace through non interference. So make no mistake, when we talk about the genocide in Gaza, the escalating war with Iran that the US is leading, the US proxy war in Ukraine, all of these wars are meant to derail the rise of the global South and, dare I say, repress them in order to maintain US hegemony. This is the context with which I wanted to approach the question of authoritarianism and repression, because in the Western mainstream media, we are often told that it is China that is authoritarian, it is Russia that is authoritarian. And because of the long legacy of the Cold War, many believe it. Public opinion of China, while Xiao Hongshu actually gave in the TikTok ban, actually gave China more points on the score of favorability in US public opinion. Actually, it is still very, very low, with nearly 3/4 of Americans polling that they have an unfavorable view of China. And the same goes for Russia and really any country that the US has set its sights on for war. So we have to ask ourselves, what does authoritarianism actually mean? And who gets to decide what authoritarianism is? Uh, Always, it is not a coincidence that authoritarianism equals in the mainstream Western media and to US and Western elites China, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, Syria before the fall of Bashar al Assad, all the countries and nations that the US is attempting to destabilize, overthrow, and put under their diktats. So, while, for example, we don't have to agree with everything that Vladimir Putin believes, that really is for Russians to decide. But we know actually why someone like Vladimir Putin is disliked by the elite. It's because he upholds Russian sovereignty and is charting a course for Russia's reemergence as a global power across Eurasia and the global south, championing things like de-dollarization and committing to a full-scale defense of Russian sovereignty, even if it means a protracted war of attrition with NATO itself. And when we look at this, when we look at how someone like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or really any leader across the global south that goes against US diktats, they're always labeled authoritarian and repression. And this is to justify wars that simply bring more destruction and more oppression. Just look at the state of Libya at this time. In 2011, Barack Obama authorized the overthrow of Libya via a US NATO bombing campaign. But it was the US and NATO that were arming the very groups that were invading NATO, which ended up taking power in a completely chaotic and, dare I say, unstable and just devastating way, which has led to Libya becoming one of the most oppressive and repressive countries in the world. Look at what has happened to Iraq. Look at what has happened to Syria of late, where Israel has carte blanche to bomb Syria whenever it likes without any resistance from the so-called government there, which is simply Al Qaeda rebranded. Authoritarianism, as a word used by Western elites, US elites, and propagated by their intelligence operatives in the Western media, is simply nothing more than the justification, the propaganda meant to get us to believe that we need to sign on to wars that simply benefit the few at the expense of the many. And of course, this carries so much hypocrisy because we know that the United States is itself incredibly repressive, with one of every 8 prisoners, I believe, living in the United States, imprisoned in the United States, where the US has over 2 million prisoners, where police budgets are incredibly bloated, where we see, as mentioned in the introduction of the program, activists, journalists being arrested, being detained, even being deported simply for expressing their views of solidarity with Palestine and putting that into peaceful, relatively peaceful action. So, this is only scratching the surface. The US has political prisoners itself. The US was the reason why Julian Assange languished in prison, in a virtual prison for so long, almost to the point of his death. We can go on and on and on. And then there are, of course, the regimes. That's another word, regime. Every time the US wants to paint a country as authoritarian, it uses the word regime. But the regimes that the US supports, for example, Israel, which during the 12-day war with Iran instituted a full blackout of its media in order to hide the damage that Iran's missiles did to cities like Tel Aviv. And of course, we know what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people with tens of thousands of prisoners. And of course, now the hundreds of thousands, both dead and displaced by their genocide. Saudi Arabia, Ukraine, which has literal Nazis inside of its government and fighting in their armed forces. This is what is considered democratic to the United States. And we are told that it is China and Russia, Iran, etc., that are the authoritarian countries. So we really do have to draw, in my estimation, a direct line from U.S. foreign policy to domestic repression, because as Code Pink has been following so closely, the escalation of repression at home, whether it's through mass surveillance, whether it's through the just absolute explosion of the prison population, the fact that U.S. police forces all across the United States are training in Israel, including the New York NYPD. They train in Israel on the tactics of quote unquote counterterrorism. But really, all that means is using the same mechanisms of death, destruction, and repression that are used on the Palestinians on poor people and working people here in the United States. So there is literally a direct line between U.S. foreign policy and U.S. domestic repression. And this goes now even further because the empire, as I said, is in decline. And we've seen how in this decline, as the U.S. is having more and more difficulty expressing its will and imposing its will on rising powers like China and Russia, the mechanisms of repression are employed in the United States to further cement the idea that Russia and China and Iran, et cetera, are the enemies. And that means making the enemies of people who are simply opposing the policies of war against these countries, now called state affiliated media, as we saw for many people in independent media be labeled just because they travel to China, they have relationships with people in China. The same goes for Russia. We saw the sanctions against Russia take down independent media in the United States. We saw Lee Camp, a friend of ours, he had his media completely ripped off of YouTube because of this suppression campaign. And even African Stream, an outlet that covers affairs on the African continent, because Tony Blinken said they were affiliated with Russia, African Stream was suppressed on all platforms just to reinforce this notion that Russia is the one pulling the strings behind independent voices. This is the moment that we live in where we have the most intense contradictions, the repression, for example, of Palestinians, the fact that we have fewer and fewer even just civil liberties here in the United States. But that is now extending into a full foreign policy agenda that is meant to reorient us back to a Cold War 2.0, as Carl said, right here at home. We are supposed to be the foot soldiers for a new McCarthyism. So the really appreciative thing that what I really appreciate about Code Pink is how it resists wars. And this resistance is now, it is undeniable. It is impossible to hold back the truth about what is happening in the world, so much so that now an anti-war movement has to come into recognition of what is happening, especially for countries resisting U.S. hegemony, whether it's China, Russia, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela. These countries are not only painted as authoritarian because they are resisting empire, they are painted as authoritarian because they are
Sorry, I'm
actually
so hot and
promoting they are actually promoting and building.
Oh, Danny, you're muted.
Where did I leave off? Sorry. What was I saying? So countries that are painted as authoritarian, like China, Russia, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, they are not only painted as authoritarian because they're resisting empire and opposing its diktats all around the world, but they themselves are building both at home and abroad a more fair and just system. They are promoting alternatives to neoliberal economics. They are using the state apparatus to address the needs of the people. They are developing infrastructure and developing the means of production so that prosperity can be, as China calls it, common, not just resigned to the very few elites and oligarchs that dominate the US and Western world. And so the multipolar world, this is what it's really all about. This is why there's a war against it. This is why BRICS expansion is driving Donald Trump mad. This is why Vladimir Putin is driving the United States and the West mad. It's not because they're repressive. It's not because they're undemocratic. It's because if they are allowed to grow and rise, then the U.S. empire's demise will be even faster than it already is. So that's why I focus my work on the alternative development that is happening all across the world, the multipolar world. This is why I try to put a lens on the realities of what is happening in China as well as China's foreign policy, why I believe it's so important to cover as closely as possible what's happening in Ukraine and, of course, in West Asia, where we see the most horrific, one of the most horrific acts of genocide be committed against the people. I try very hard. It's so important to ensure that the Palestinian people and the cause of Palestinian resistance, with all of the repression that Palestinians are going through, to ensure that it is understood by Western and U.S. audiences that they are not alone, that they not only are they not alone, but their struggle is simply not a struggle that they are waging by themselves, that this really is what they are going through, really is part of a global, not just a global movement for justice with which the solidarity for the Palestinian people has reflected, but what is happening to Palestine is a reflection and deeply connected to the aims of empire, which is to cause the most amount of suffering possible so that self-determination, so that multipolarity, and so that a more fair and just world order cannot emerge. That's all I have. I think I'm over the 15 minutes, so I will give it back to Carl.
Thank you so much, Danny. Just a reminder to everyone to keep yourselves on mute. And if you have any questions for Danny or Carl, please put them in the chat and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. So with that, I would like to welcome back Carl. Thank
Hi,
you.
thank you for welcoming me back. As Danny have mentioned, every accusation is a confession. When United States accuse China or Russia or Iran of being repressive regimes or being surveillance states, this is because they want to distract you from what's actually happening at home. Right now, United States government is suppressing pro-Palestinian voices on all platforms. At the same time, the U.S. government is handing over all your data to Palantir. I mean, we are constructing a surveillance state in the United States as we speak. Again, I like to share why I decided to speak up, to add my own voice to debunk a lot of the propaganda that has been waged, in particular against China, because I was born in China in 1976, 1 month after Mao died. So I'm the first post-cultural generation Chinese that grew up there. I spent the entire 8 decades of 1980s in China. I have a very happy childhood. That's why I always have a very fond memories of China. And then I came to United States in the 1990 to join my parents who were my dad was studying for his PhD at University of Illinois at Chicago. At this time I was very hungry for news of my homeland, so I would search for newspapers, Wall Street Journals, New York Times, for any mentioning of China. At that time I delivered New York Times. You know, I was a newspaper boy in high school, so I get the chance to read New York Times every day. And to my surprise, the China they mention in their pages resemble nothing like the country I have left behind. It's almost like they're describing a bizarro world. I didn't at that time. I just chalk it off as the Western mind just couldn't comprehend the inscrutable Orientals. They just don't get China. So until when I started working in the early 2000s, I started reading this expat magazine from based out of Russia by a bunch of Americans, including none other than Matt Taibbi before he went mainstream and joined the tech oligarchs. And I remember one thing Matt Taibbi mentioned was when they do reports on Russia, post-Soviet Russia, usually they will work from a template, and he would have the whole story constructed before he even got off the plane, uh, arriving in Tashkent, where he's supposed to interview the local sources. All he had to do was just fill in the blanks for the names he interviewed. That's when I realized this is the same reporting they have been doing on China. This is the same playbook. This was not cultural misunderstanding. This was active propaganda. And why U.S. government is waging endless propaganda against the perceived enemies, but waging the propaganda on its own population? Well, if you look at the history, the collapse of the Soviet Union has been disastrous for the American working class. During the Cold War, the U.S. elite had to make concessions. They had to make a lot of concession to its workers in order to compete with the Soviet Union ideologically. As the first Cold War wrapped to an end, the U.S. elite no longer feel the need to share the fruits with the working classes. This is why we have seen they're clawing back. They have been clawing back all the concessions they have made during the Cold War. This is why we're seeing an increase income disparity, with all the fruits of benefits of globalization accruing to the top 1%. And this is the condition that the US elite do not want you to worry yourself over. Instead, they want you to focus on the evil, bad China, Russia, Iran. Now it got so ridiculous. We have former CIA coming out and saying Epstein might be a Russian or Chinese intelligence asset. I'm sure nobody actually believed that, but right now their goal is just to throw crap on the wall and see what sticks. The one thing one thing I have realized is the Americans have been relentlessly propagandized for decades. And one reason, the right now there's such a low public opinion of China. If you look at the charts, this actually happened only in the last decades or so. And this is not because something China did. This is because the U.S. now spends the Congress approved somewhere like $1.6 billion of funding going to fund the anti-China propaganda voices. Why do they do that? Because China for the last 40 years have not invaded any countries. They have not tried to destabilize any government abroad. Instead, they concentrated on their own development. They left 800 million people out of poverty. They now have, I remember 2008 when I was in LA. That there was at that time, I was dating a Japanese woman working out of a Japanese consulate, and her job was to um, to facilitate the Japanese businessmen who came to California to work out the deal on the high-speed rail. And 2008 was the same time when China started its high-speed rail project. The difference couldn't be more. The contrast couldn't be more stark, and this is why United States have to demonize China, because they don't want people to look at China as a successful working model of development. United States don't believe development anymore, and not just for development for abroad, but even development within the United States. Now everything is about rent seeking, about sucking up the wealth from everyone, Americans, foreigners alike, up to the top 1%. How many times do I have left?
Grace, do we have a time?
Yeah, you can go for like a few more minutes, Carl. You're good.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. So the U.S. U.S. campaign against China actually started in the first Obama administration when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. This is where she coined the term pivot to Asia. When she talked about pivot to Asia, she's not talking about pivoting economic investment into Asia. She's talking about pivoting military hardware to Asia to confront China. This, of course, feeds into the U.S. military industrial complex. It only intensified under Donald Trump. Now, the only difference with Donald Trump is that he says the quiet things aloud. It's an emperor has no clothes moment. I mean, Obama was he was a very suave face of the Wall Street, whereas with Trump, it was just naked aggression, very apparent for everyone to see. And but whatever Trump is doing is actually accelerating the decline of the American empire as he slapped tariffs on everyone, allies, enemies alike. And U.S. have very few true allies. What U.S. have is vassal states, and Donald Trump is demanding them to bend the knee publicly to humiliate themselves. And this is, I think, the fact that U.S. society and U.S. government is highly dysfunctional is now is I think everyone can see that. So what they do is they want to distract you with even more propaganda. While they crack down on pro-Palestinian voices, while they crack down on dissent domestically, they want you to think our number one threat actually come from China and Russia, which it couldn't be further from the truth. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl and Danny. So we're going to be moving into our Q&A portion. So for anyone who has a question, please put your questions in the chat. But I'll start us off because I saw a couple comments about this, and you both talked about it. But I think it's an area a lot of people, even in the anti-war movement, kind of get hung up on. So I think we can, just cover it again, drive it home a little bit, which is this term authoritarian and how it is, constantly weaponized by US media and politicians to describe other countries, especially right now, China, to play into this narrative of democracy versus authoritarianism in order to justify US aggression abroad and to delegitimize any resistant movements happening at home. So can you help us expose this myth a little bit more, especially in regards to China and Russia? And how do you both understand this word and who is actually, wielding this authoritarian power today?
We can just
Yeah.
look at the public opinion polls, right? I mean, polls after polls, it shows the Chinese people are one of the far most optimistic people on the globe right now. They're optimistic about their future. They think their life is going to get better 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And if you look at the approval rating for the government, the Chinese government actually ranked pretty high in contrast to, say, Donald Trump's own approval ratings. And this does mean something. I mean, that we can see the results. We're not talking about abstract concept here. People in China, they see their life improving. This is why they're optimistic about their future. That cannot be said about what's happening in the West right now, especially in the United States. The youngs are getting squeezed out. They're getting squeezed out of the job market. They have very dim economic prospect. And this is because the US government is a government of the oligarchs, by the oligarchs, for the oligarchs. And it's structured to continue to funnel wealth toward the top 1%.
Yeah. And I can add to this that, I've covered this in my writings quite deeply. The definition of so-called democracy and authoritarianism, and how the United States wields this term, both of these terms, to serve their interests. Now, the really interesting thing about authoritarianism is that whenever it is wielded against a particular target of war, it's usually because that country is actually doing something or many things very well, especially in the interests of their people. For example, when Bashar al-Assad was called a dictator um, and the purveyor of chemical weapons attacks that were never proven. It was because Syria, under his leadership at that time, was engaged in a vicious and very ferocious defense of their sovereignty from a literal proxy invasion. And we can just go across the board. China, when it comes to China, it is authoritarian because it is not following the rules and laws of the so-called quote unquote rules-based order to simply serve the United States. It is employing and organizing an economy that serves China and Chinese people. This is why, as Carl said, Chinese people are so optimistic. It's why they have 90+% trust in the government of China. And when Carl referenced the pivot to Asia, it's really important to note that the pivot to Asia was announced not so far from when China launched its Belt and Road Initiative in 2000, I believe it was 2013. And the Belt and Road Initiative, which is now, worth over $1 trillion US, thousands upon thousands of projects all across the world, connecting countries in West Asia, Africa, Latin America together through rail, through all kinds of infrastructure, ports, etc. This has been massively successful. The global south and even much of the west, for example, like Greece, and it wasn't so long ago that Italy, before it essentially bowed down to the United States and pulled out of the Belt and Road Initiative, but even countries in the west are very interested in the Belt and Road Initiative. Greece's most important port is built with Chinese cooperation. And so the huge aim for the United States in using authoritarianism, I'll give the example of Russia. Like, if Russia was operating like Boris Yeltsin's Russia, we wouldn't hear about Russia being quote unquote authoritarian. There would be no problem with Russia because at that time, Russia was selling off all of its assets and was begging to be a willing and compliant servant to Western domination. Now, the opposite is true. Now, Russia, because Russian people demand this, Russia has to invest in the Russian economy and it has to invest in Russian sovereignty. And this is the big problem for the United States because sovereign Russia, even dismembered from the rest of the Soviet Union, is too much of a threat. We saw this with the Wolfowitz Doctrine. The whole aim of the Wolfowitz Doctrine was to dismember Russia. And Zbigniew Brzezinski also had this in mind with the whole grand chessboard theory. There was going to be no alternatives to the United States empire. It doesn't matter what model or form it takes. If they have an alternative that does not bow down to the US, it must be destroyed. And so that's why these countries are called authoritarian.
Thank you. I see a question about TikTok and this increasing fear of China spying and collecting people's information. There's just been, a huge surge in the past few years of fear mongering around China, bipartisan, from TikTok bans to the vilification of Chinese technology and business, and these articles people are writing about how China's, hacking into coffee makers and compiling personal dossiers on every single person in the US. And now Chinese students and scholars are being increasingly surveyed and targeted in the US under, the pretext of national security, as they say. Can you talk a little bit about what's really behind all this hostility and all these articles?
First of all, we have a capture of the White House by the tech bros of the Silicon Valley. That's evident, especially since the Trump second term. And TikTok is a big enemy for Facebook, for Meta and for Google. And they have been plowing tons of money into the US Congress trying to get TikTok banned. And we do have the best Congress people that money can buy. So, they are doing their job. And at the same time, the military industrial complex, they all want to spread this paranoia about the Chinese products as a potential spy. You know what? I don't really care because I hold a US passport. China can't have my data, but China don't have a jurisdiction over me. What I'm really worried about is you now Palantir have all my data through all the U.S. government records. Now, U.S. government do have jurisdiction over me. I will be more worried about NSA reading my emails than somehow, TikTok knows my browsing habits. Because they're welcome to it. It's right now when I'm online, I just assume anything I do online is transparent to everybody. But the idea that somehow a Chinese app, an entertainment app, is an existential threat to the U.S. national security is ridiculous. They're just trying to label anything Chinese national security now. Uh, you have people, this Florida congressman, what's his name, Scott. Anyway, he said the garlic, the Chinese imported garlic into United States is a national security, and so the idea is pushing for decoupling from China. Now, this idea actually originated with Pentagon because the idea is U.S. and Chinese economy are too intertwined that makes a hot war conflict complicated for United States because then there will be blowbacks. And so the idea is if we cut ties completely, then we can go to war with China on not worrying about the economic blowback. Of course, this is really a dumb idea. When now we know the U.S. military themselves rely on parts sourced from China, particularly rare earth elements. They need the rare earth heat-resistant magnet that goes into F-35 and missiles. And this is why now they're screaming when China suddenly put export control on rare earth export to the U.S. military U.S. military industrial complex. And I mean. This is why the whole idea of the tariff regime came into being. Now the tariff could work. Tariff could actually promote industry. If you actually have industry, United States have been hollowing out manufacturing for the last 40 years, and now they try to put tariff and you don't have any industry to build up with. So it's gonna take decades to rebuild those industries. And in the meantime, you are just increasing the cost of doing business and you're increasing uncertainty in investment. And this is why a lot of the business are holding off on future investment right now in United States, which led to a problem in unemployment. And because the young people are entering into a very uncertain job market at the time when Donald Trump just made the business environment even more precarious. But the whole idea that somehow China is to blame for the malaise of neoliberal economic policies that was pursued by the Wall Street, I mean that's just patently ridiculous.
Yeah, and I'll just say that what Edward Snowden revealed alone years ago is enough. I think I would hope, and it did have this effect when it was revealed. Should be enough to convince the vast majority of people, ordinary people in the United States at least, and much of the world, who the real surveillance, authoritarian machine really is, what it really is, and that's the United States. It's so the hypocrisy is just stunning because we have witnessed, especially over the last 25 years or so, the complete obliteration of even just basic civil liberties, the right to due process, things like this, completely eroded and eviscerated, all in the name of whether it's counterterror, whether it's against what we've been talking about today, right? So-called authoritarian actors, interference in elections, all of this. We've seen the erosion of virtually every single right that, even if they never were applied to everyone, which is the truth of all of the constitutional rights in the United States, the fact is that everybody now is losing them to a certain degree in order to justify the things that Carl was just talking about, neoliberal plunder, the consolidation of wealth in the hands of the few, and of course the foreign policy of the empire that is required to get that done. And all of this is a reflection. It's so desperate when we see Tom Cotton, Carl, you were talking about Rick Scott, I think, Florida, when we see them so desperately try to evoke the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, the CPC is what they're actually referring to. But when they are doing this in trying to put TikTok into some kind of larger agenda of China to spy on every American, to steal all the information, all the technology, this is something that the United States has been doing for a long time. During the conflict in Syria, the war in Syria, for example, when it was raging, there were times in 2012, for example, where the United States' intelligence agencies were working to take down Syria's entire internet infrastructure. We are talking about the United States, which has the most advanced mechanisms of surveillance in the world, which is spying not only in each and every one of us, but is attempting to do this also to each and every one of its so-called adversaries as well. We know the kind of technology that Israel employs. Israel would not be able to do what it did, for example, to Lebanon without the US's support, especially intel support. This is often understated because there is this idea that like Mossad is the biggest and baddest, but the truth is that if Israeli intelligence didn't have the US to lean on, it wouldn't be able to do these horrific things like we saw in Iran, of course, like we're seeing in Palestine, Lebanon, etc. So the fact of the matter is it's absolutely absurd to believe that China, which has a track record of investing in itself, and when it does invest abroad, it is doing so with the aim of increasing the prosperity of all parties involved, that somehow spy technology, stealing information would benefit China. China doesn't, it's not a secret to China what the US is doing. The United States is not necessarily hiding its overall agenda against China. So I think it's a very telling moment in history where we have the United States' empire's mask completely off, and now they are resorting to those who control it are resorting to the most heinous and absurd of lies to essentially cover up what they themselves are actually doing. And I think that's the big lesson and takeaway from this absurd campaign against China vis-a-vis TikTok.
So here's an interesting question from someone in the audience, and they say their question is to both speakers. Can we imagine a more just world post-US empire and a multipolar world led by China, Russia, and Iran? And they also add that their question is based on the theory of power politics, which is hierarchical, anarchic, and whoever is at the helm of power seizes more territories, resources, etc.
Right. So this is a talking point often among the U.S. National security establishment. The claim is China is seeking to unseat United States as a global hegemon, because the underlying assumption is that what US doing is normal. So everybody else must work, think exactly, behave exactly like United States. I often talk about US exceptionalism, but when it comes to imperialism, I do think the U.S. exceptionalism is real. I mean, the world has never seen anything like the U.S. empire today that has spanning the globe, that's destabilizing government, destabilizing regions. One of the things the U.S. have done in the last several decades is literally lighting fire all over the globe. So it makes United States itself seems this oasis of calm. So people will have to continually recycle their US dollar savings back into the US bond market, stock market, and real estate market to prop up the US economy. And that's not how China works. China has been like Danny has pointed out, China has been investing in global infrastructure. The idea is to increase global connectivity. Now, U.S. sees that, oh, China is expanding its global footprint to build dual-use ports that could also be used by Chinese Navy. Because this is exactly how United States view the world. Everything is zero sum. Everything is through a lens of military domination. What China had, China actually very much like to have a good relationship with the United States. After all, U.S. is one of China's largest market. Even after all this tariff business, U.S. is still the number three export market for China. China has no interest to see a collapse of the United States the way that U.S. very much would like to see collapse of China, Russia, Iran, etc. These are the main differences. China is not seeking to be the next global hegemon. The whole idea of the BRICS is not about building a NATO 2.0, but with China, Russia, or Iran at the top. The whole idea of BRICS is a collective nations where sovereignty foremost respected. U.S. empire do not believe in sovereignty because sovereignty is anathema to empire. This is why Donald Trump is beating down all the supposedly U.S. ally right now. Europeans and Asians because the empire demands obeisance. They demands the demands unconditional surrender of your sovereignty. Whereas, China's goal has been pretty apparent, for last 20 years, 20, 30, 40 years. China goal has been trying to develop itself and is trying to do business with everyone. There's a saying, China's business is business. U.S. business is war. The two are not equivalent. I agree with many U.S. Politicians. There's no moral equivalency between U.S. and China. China is a far more moral nation than the U.S. empire.
Yeah, and I'll just add to this the fact that with this question, it's a very good one, and thankfully we see the examples of a fair and more just world order already occurring, and those three countries are not the only countries championing it and paving the road to this more fair and just world order, but they are the most important, arguably. And we see this. Let's just start with Iran. Iran is the only nation state left in that region which is unconditionally and fully supporting Palestinian resistance and the entire resistance against Israeli and U.S. expansionism. Russia, we see how Russia is fighting back against NATO expansionism in across its Eurasian territory. That is what Ukraine was always all about, and arguably Russia waited too long to get involved, but it got involved. It became militarily involved because it is now not only existential, but it's part of stopping what is a complete disaster for humanity, which is full spectrum dominance by the United States and its NATO vassals. And then China, Carl mentioned the infrastructure development. There are so many examples of how this development is critical for the world already. For example, Laos now has a high-speed rail that is connecting it not only to China, but the rest of the region and its borders. And that has already reaped massive economic headwinds, increased tourism, and brought to what is a country that has a difficult time connecting to the world, far more connectivity than it has in the past. In Pakistan, there's a China-Pakistan economic corridor, and Pakistan's history and its relationship to U.S. empire, for example, is one that has brought it lots of economic misery. But the China-Pakistan economic corridor has done things like help it develop electricity infrastructure and its first metro station in the capital of of Pakistan, Lahore. So on and on and on. We can go on and on and on. You know, the 5G technology, the electric grids built all across the African continent and Latin America, it's the same story. Without China's economic development, there would be no talk about a rising global south and the global south uh, starting to pull itself away from U.S. domination because it is China's alternative. It's its advancements. It is at a stage that many global South countries say they want to be in. They want to get to the position where they are able to develop independently, economically, and to achieve that kind of prosperity.
Thank you. I appreciate you both exposing the myth, of this capitalist imperialist zero-sum thinking, and just because it's the reality and for us in the imperial court doesn't mean it's the global rule. So I appreciate you talking to that. We're coming down to the end, but I did want to just circle back briefly to just more domestic repression, and there was a couple questions about um, how do you think U.S. institutions and universities, media, and tech companies, how do they play a role in enabling this broader system of suppression, and what are the hurdles to establishing more information networks and platforms that aren't controlled and aren't monetized by people who use those platforms to push for war and to commit genocide and so on and so forth?
Well, I'll just say when it comes to, we are in an interesting phase of development itself in the United States. I'll just be very brief. A big problem with propagating and fueling so-called McCarthyism, anti-China propaganda, and of course, building a consensus, manufacturing a kind of consensus for not only the repression that happens during U.S. wars abroad, but also the mechanisms of repression at home. We are seeing this on social media. We are often told that it's us, people who are talking about how we are furious with our government's role in things like repression, surveillance, genocide, etc. Where are the problems? Where are the agents of Russia, whatever, Iran? But truthfully, what's happening with social media is not a problem of people trying to use that platform to spread a different message from the powers that be, from the establishment. It's actually the powers that be in the establishment using those mechanisms to suppress us. That is probably one of the most fundamental questions that we're going to have to deal with as we try to develop alternative media, is the fact that at any moment, it is they who control the levers of this power. They can get rid of our accounts, they can wipe our platforms away, and they can also rig them in favor of narratives that keep people worse than divided. People say keep people divided. No, it's worse than that. It's to keep people in kind of subjugated position where they not only can't think independently of themselves, but they are more likely to embrace various ideologies, various ideas, and ways of venting frustration and acting out their frustration that are just anathema to their interests. And I think that's social media as a monopoly controlled entity is serving that function. And that's the big problem with it. So I just wanted to highlight that because we're often told it's China, Russia, and whatnot that are the problem. No, it's the Elon Musks, it's the political class in the United States, it's the big tech oligarchs. They're the ones who are creating so many problems for the ability to spread the truth and reality of U.S. empire far and wide.
Yeah, I see us as fighting a guerrilla war. You just have to understand the rule of the game. You just gotta understand how to get around those censorship rules. And the important point is to get your message out. And right now there are a lot of people, particularly in the United States, are trying to seek alternative form of news. Particularly, they know the mainstream legacy media is corrupt. The problem is there's so the US they try to rig the game, try to direct you to all these so-called alternative media sources that's probably funded by USAID or the Falun Gong cults. I think it's also important for people, who are seeking truth to develop some sort of a media literacy. You kind of have to know to read behind between the lines and to understand, where that source is coming from, and then form your own judgment. It's like some of the I saw one question is about how do you explain China's treatment of Tibet and Uyghurs and the internal descent. Just travel to China. Just travel to China and see for yourself. I mean, right now there's many multiple rail lines that go into Tibet, and you can just sign up with a local Tibetan operated tour to travel to Tibet yourself. Get a Chinese visa. Danny Haiphong himself, if traveled to Xinjiang, he can probably tell you how Uyghurs are treated in Xinjiang.
All
I'll
right.
just I'll just say one thing about that. I'll just say that it's so important now that we are actually talking about genocide with Gaza to remember that we were told for years, at least, it was the hottest, probably 2018, 2019, into the throes of COVID and has cooled down since. But for several years, we were told that Uyghurs in China were the victims of genocide. Now it's impossible to do that because Palestinians are actually the ones experiencing genocide. But if you go to Xinjiang, if you were to go to Xinjiang and just from what we know what's happening in Palestine, you would see uh, the exact opposite going on. You would see economic development, you would see prosperity, you would see people living their lives, people being a part of a society and a system as equal members of it, and sometimes even prioritize members of it, because that's how ethnic minorities are treated in China. They are given priority for education and jobs, etc. Um, versus Palestine, which is, I mean, it is hell on earth. And so that contrast is just important to highlight because we don't hear so much of it anymore, but to this day, you will get the anti-China sycophants talking about the Uyghurs.
It served as a distraction to the real genocide that's happening in Gaza. I remember in 2018 when, but because Israel has been bombing Gaza forever. I remember when 2018 when Israelis were doing their repression of housing in Gaza. You have New York pages on New York Times splash with title about how Xinjiang is the world's largest open air prison. And if you search that on Google, and all the articles come up is from the legacy media about Xinjiang, when everybody knows Gaza was the world's largest open air prison. So they're literally trying to game the search engine. They try to literally trying to flood all the info sources with distractions so you don't look where they don't want you to look. But I think it's harder and harder for them to do that right now because China is increasingly easy to travel to. For people who don't know, you can't go to Xinjiang with any special permit as long as you have a valid Chinese visa. And if you're not a U.S., if you're a European citizen, most of the EU citizens now can travel to China 30 days visa free. So it's quite easy.
Yes, and I also highly recommend anyone here to travel to China and see China for yourself and experience that reality. But with that, just thank you so much to both of you, Danny and Carl, for an amazing discussion. We really appreciate you joining us tonight and just for all the work that you do. So thank you. And for anyone who wants to learn more about the China's Not Our Enemy campaign, you can visit codepink.org/China. And with that, I will pass it back to Grace to close us out.
Thank you so much, Carl, Danny, and Megan. That was such an amazing session on U.S. aggression on journalists, on its people, on Palestine, on China, and on peace activists and organizers. As we say every session, and especially when we're talking about China, in order to deliver a true peace economy here in the US, we need to equip ourselves with the understanding of the opposition and find tools to dissemble its systematic harm towards people here in the belly of the beast and throughout the world. Just as Megan just said, there are so many amazing, incredible resources, events, and actions put on by Code Pink's China's Not Our Enemy campaign. And there's even a working group that you can join to get in on the creation of these amazing resources. So please check out Megan's amazing landing page and the working group's amazing hard work. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll see you at the next one.